Great to see King Charles III back in action.
Keir Starmer would lock him up. How dare you make comments about his death?
Whose streets? Whose streets?
Watch as Brits attending the Unite the Kingdom rally are derided as fascists by left-wing activists.
Today with one clear message: fascists, you are not welcome here. Refugees are welcome here. We will not allow their racism, their Islamophobia, their anti-Semitism and their fascism to take root in our communities. As Tommy Robinson and his supporters mobilise on our streets again today, we need to let them know London is not theirs, Coventry is not theirs, no city, no town in the UK, it's theirs. Whose streets? Our streets! Whose streets? Our streets!
Well, be careful since the general election.
But hang on a minute, let's put it a different way. If the Prime Minister has lied to the Commons, do you agree that's a resignation event? Yes.
Upbeat, optimistic, full of energy, and the party is in good shape. But I did say, there were two things I said in particular at the conference. The first was that I thought this government and the British economy were in far deeper trouble than most people realised, and that I did not believe the government would last a full 4 years, thinking myself that a general election by 2027 was entirely possible. Seems to me, given events of the last week, it could happen even more quickly than that. I don't know. But I also admitted...
What you wish for, Kemi Badenoch?
What I'm doing is turning the Conservative Party into the traditional, authentic conservatism that people recognise. And that's going to mean taking some tough decisions. I'm afraid if people don't like it, then they are welcome to leave.
The Conservative Party is over. Over as a national party, over as the opposition to the left. That is the cry from Danny Kruger MP, a shadow Tory minister who has sensationally defected to Reform UK today, the first sitting MP to do so, little after a year.
Look where we are now. We've had 2 senior resignations in the space of 2 weeks. We have had the outrageous situation where the Prime Minister and the Labour Party were defending this week appointing the best pal of a convicted paedophile as US ambassador. The Prime Minister's authority is just totally shot.
OK, so should he resign, Keir Starmer?
Well, I think we've got big questions that we need answered about him and his chief of staff. You know, what did they know and when? I think we need to see, what we're going to do first, Camilla, is use every parliamentary avenue available to us to try and get the information into the public domain for what actually happened and when, what happened in the vetting process, what information was given to the Prime Minister, what information was given to his chief of staff.
Well, hang on a minute.
Who overruled any concerns that were raised?
Laura Trott, you can't have a situation where the Leader of the Opposition is accusing the Prime Minister of lying to the House of Commons, misleading Parliament, which is a resignation offence, and then not call for him to resign. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, Peter Mandelson told Harry Cole on Tuesday morning that there was more information to come, Downing Street has sat on it, the Prime Minister's not been honest with MPs, and then when I ask you, should he resign, start obfuscating yourself.
I don't think it's obfuscating so much as being very clear about what the process should be from this point, Camilla. And I've said very clearly that Kemi is not buying it. I'm not buying it. I don't think the British public are buying it. The next step in this is to be transparent about all the information, and then we can go from there.
But hang on a minute, let's put it a different way. If the Prime Minister has lied to the Commons, do you agree that's a resignation event?
Yes.
Did Keir Starmer just trigger the biggest political revolt Britain has seen in decades? The Labour leader thought he could tighten his grip, silence the countryside and crush dissent with the stroke of a pen. But instead, he unleashed a fury that spread from the fields of Kent to the streets of London. What began as a tax proposal buried in jargon has now exploded into a nationwide crisis. Tractors blocking roads, farmers dragged by police, Nigel Farage intercepting arrests, and even Tommy Robinson entering the fight demanding Starmer's resignation. The quiet countryside has become a battlefield, and Starmer is standing at the centre of a storm he can no longer control. It started quietly, as it always does. Starmer rolled out Labour's policy with his usual smooth language, fairness, justice, responsibility. To the media and city elites, it was framed as a simple adjustment, a tax reform aimed at balancing the books. But beneath the polished press releases was a weapon aimed straight at the countryside. A new levy on farmland valued over £1 million, sold as minor, harmless, just another line in the long list of Labour's progressive changes. Yet outside Westminster, the story was very different. For farmers, this wasn't a tax tweak. It was an existential threat. Their land is more than property. It is family, history and survival. Strip that away with inheritance levies and you don't just take money. You take legacy. You destroy generations of work, sweat and sacrifice. That is how farmers saw it, and that is why the fields erupted. At first, it was whispers, local meetings in barns, rural families sitting around tables calculating what would happen if Labour's plan became law, fathers telling sons they might lose the farm, mothers warning daughters their inheritance would be debt, not land. Those whispers turned into anger, and anger turned into action. The tractors rolled in. Highways were blocked, Parliament Square choked with diesel fumes, Labour offices surrounded by farmers dumping harvests at the doors. No farmers, no food wasn't just a slogan, it was a warning. Britain's breadbasket was going on strike. And Starmer, he panicked. Instead of listening, he reached for force. Peaceful protests were rebranded as unrest. Rural organisers, some old enough to remember Thatcher's battles, found themselves on police watch lists. Phones were tapped, homes monitored, names collected. Behind closed doors, Labour strategists plotted strategic arrests to decapitate the movement. But Britain was about to learn something Starmer had forgotten. You cannot cage the countryside. Because when the crackdown began, when riot vans rolled into villages and elderly farmers were dragged away, the backlash grew. Videos went viral. Ordinary Brits who never cared about rural politics watched in horror as men and women in muddy boots were treated like criminals for defending their land. Anger spread from villages to cities, from the countryside to the suburbs. Labour wasn't just fighting farmers anymore, it was fighting Britain itself. And that's when the first shockwave hit. From the shadows of political exile stepped Nigel Farage. He didn't creep in, he stormed onto the stage, seizing the moment with his trademark fire. On GB News, on Reform UK platforms, at rallies, he exposed what Labour was doing. He called it what Starmer couldn't hide. Economic cleansing, a war on the countryside disguised as climate responsibility. He didn't just speak, he mobilised. Legal observers appeared at protests. Hotlines were set up for farmers under police threat. Every leak, every memo, every whisper from inside Labour's machine was dragged into the light. The arrests that Labour planned, Farage blocked them. His legal teams, his media platforms, his sheer presence made it impossible for police to quietly crush the movement. He turned what was supposed to be a quiet crackdown into a national scandal. Suddenly, Starmer wasn't just fighting farmers, he was fighting Farage and losing. But the rebellion didn't stop there. Another figure entered the storm, and his arrival pushed the crisis into uncharted territory. Tommy Robinson. For years, Labour branded him as a pariah, an extremist, someone to ignore. But in this moment of chaos, Robinson's voice struck a chord with thousands. He rallied supporters not just from rural communities, but from towns and cities long abandoned by Labour. His message was simple and brutal. Starmer must resign. And this time, it wasn't just a fringe demand. It was echoed across protest lines, across online platforms, across angry households who had never marched for anything before. The convergence was historic. Farmers in tractors, Reform UK activists, Robinson supporters, disillusioned Labour voters all stood against Starmer. What had begun as a technical tax policy had now grown into something bigger, a nationwide uprising. And as if that wasn't enough, whispers from the palace added fuel. King Charles, furious at the chaos and the humiliation of seeing farmers dragged across roads, reportedly sent stern messages to ministers. The monarchy itself was watching, and Labour's control was slipping further with each passing day. Highways jammed with tractors, police forces stretched thin, rural councils in revolt, Labour councillors resigning in disgust. And at the heart of it all, Starmer's mask was gone. The moderate reformer was exposed as a desperate technocrat, clinging to power with threats and force. He declared war on the countryside, and the countryside declared war back. And this was just the beginning. Because as Britain entered its second week of rebellion, the fight was no longer about policy. It was about survival, legitimacy, and whether Keir Starmer's government could survive the storm it had unleashed. The second week of protests didn't just rattle the Labour Party, it shook the entire nation. What Keir Starmer thought would be a controlled operation, a demonstration of authority, quickly spiralled into a full-scale rebellion that his government could neither predict nor contain. The countryside wasn't merely resisting anymore, it was revolting. Entire regions fell silent as farms stood empty, cattle unfed, and harvests abandoned. Britain woke up to the reality that the food supply chain was grinding to a halt. Shelves in some towns began to look bare. Prices of essentials started creeping upward. And for the first time in years, the public understood a painful truth. The farmers had real power and they were no longer willing to be ignored. What did Starmer do? He doubled down. He stepped onto the podium again, repeating words about climate justice, fairness and responsibility, as if reciting a script could erase what the country had seen. He called the protests coordinated disruptions. He accused the farmers of being manipulated by political extremists. In one speech, he even dared to label them security risks. That single phrase spread like wildfire, igniting even more fury, because to the countryside, being called a security risk was not just insulting, it was betrayal. Men and women who had fed the nation for generations were now branded as enemies of the state by their own Prime Minister. The backlash was immediate. Videos of Starmer's speeches were clipped and mocked online. Farmers at the protests held up new signs. Security risk equals farmer. Elderly men in flat caps, women who had worked the land for 40 years, young lads driving tractors, all of them chanting in unison that they would not be silenced. The harder Labour tried to control the story, the faster it spun out of control. And then came the arrests. Despite warnings from senior judges, despite leaks from the judiciary declaring Labour's plan unlawful and tyrannical, Starmer's inner circle ordered the police to move in. Rural protest leaders were dragged from their homes at dawn. Some were in their 60s, even 70s. Yet police treated them like hardened criminals. Videos of elderly farmers handcuffed in front of their grandchildren went viral, sparking national outrage. Labour spokesman tried to spin it as enforcing public order. But no amount of spin could erase the image of riot vans parked outside peaceful villages. Nigel Farage was quick to act. He took to the airwaves with one explosive line. "This is not law enforcement, this is state terror against Britain's backbone." His words cut through the noise, resonating with millions who had never cared about politics before. Reform UK mobilised faster than Labour could react. Volunteer lawyers descended on police stations. Farmers under arrest suddenly had legal shields around them. Leaked memos, damning reports, secret recordings, all of it was funneled through Reform UK and blasted across media platforms. Farage had turned the crisis into a war of exposure, dragging every shadowy move Labour made into the public eye. And then the unexpected happened. The police themselves began to fracture. Some officers quietly refused to participate in the dawn raids. Rural police forces, whose own families often came from farming backgrounds, showed hesitation. Leaks revealed that senior officers privately warned the Home Office that morale was collapsing. "We are not at war with our people," one officer allegedly said. That single phrase, whispered in private, eventually leaked to the press, fueling an even bigger storm. The protests grew. They were no longer limited to the countryside. In cities across the UK, from Birmingham to Manchester, ordinary citizens began marching in solidarity. Students, shopkeepers and even city workers joined the farmers. High streets filled with chants. London itself became a battlefield of ideas, with Parliament surrounded by blockades that grew larger every day. By the third week, it wasn't just farmers, reform activists or Robinson supporters. It was Britain rising up. Inside Labour, panic set in, backbench MPs whispered about rebellion, councillors resigned in protest, some publishing scathing letters about Labour's betrayal of working people. A few brave MPs even broke ranks publicly, warning that Starmer's war on the countryside would tear the party apart. Starmer's allies tried to hold the line, but the fractures were too deep. The longer they tried to enforce discipline, the more obvious the cracks became, and in the middle of this chaos, another powerful figure stirred, King Charles. Though constitutionally restrained, the king could not remain silent forever. Rumours began to spread that he had privately expressed fury over the treatment of farmers. He reportedly sent a sharp warning to ministers that Britain could not afford to see its farmers criminalised. While palace officials denied the leaks that the damage was already done. The image of a furious king only deepened the impression that Starmer had lost control of the country. Meanwhile, the judiciary escalated its quiet rebellion. More leaks emerged. A memo surfaced from a senior judge calling Labour's crackdown a gross abuse of power. Legal scholars began to speak out, warning that Labour's actions were not just politically reckless, they were legally indefensible. Even sections of the usually loyal media began to question whether Starmer had gone too far. Opinion columns that once praised him now dripped with scepticism. Headlines turned against him. And when the BBC, normally cautious, aired footage of elderly farmers being dragged by police without heavy editing, it was clear the tide had turned. By this stage, the rebellion was more than protests. It had become a movement. Farmers began coordinating with truckers, with small business owners, with energy workers. Supply chains faltered not just from abandoned fields, but from deliberate strikes of solidarity. Petrol stations in some towns reported shortages as truckers refused to deliver fuel. Rural councils openly defied Labour's directives, passing motions condemning the government's policies. Britain's infrastructure was starting to creak under the weight of rebellion. And Keir Starmer? He stood at the podium again, his voice calm but his eyes betraying fear. He repeated his lines about climate justice and fairness, but nobody was listening. His words had lost all meaning. His authority was broken. Every speech was met with louder chants of resign. Every attempt at control only deepened the chaos. It was no longer a question of whether Starmer could push his policy through. The question was whether he could survive at all. His government was collapsing in real time, caught between furious farmers, a rebellious judiciary, disloyal MPs, and a population that had turned against him. The countryside had declared war, and Britain had joined them. And at the heart of it all stood Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson, unlikely allies who had seized the moment to tear the mask off Labour's polished face. The storm was no longer building, it was here, and as Britain entered the fourth week of unrest, whispers grew louder. Starmer's resignation was no longer unthinkable, it was inevitable. Britain was unrecognisable. What had started as tractors circling Parliament had transformed into a nationwide revolt, shaking the very foundations of Labour's rule. The countryside was no longer pleading, it was demanding. Cities once thought loyal to Labour joined in solidarity, while rural towns became strongholds of defiance. Starmer's government, once sold as steady and competent, now looked like a regime in freefall. Every day brought new images of chaos. Highways blocked by convoys of tractors, hay bales set alight on roundabouts, farmers pouring milk on the steps of government buildings. Villages turned into fortresses with local communities vowing to resist police intrusion. Protest signs no longer carried polite slogans, they demanded resignation. Starmer out was scrawled across banners, barns and even in fields, burned into the earth for drones and cameras to capture. And Labour's response? Brutality. Police were ordered to push harder, to make arrests regardless of age or health. Elderly farmers with walking sticks were dragged across gravel roads. Young lads barely out of their teens were shoved into vans for carrying protest flags. Women who had never once stood in a protest found themselves face to face with riot shields. And each act of force backfired spectacularly. Videos of these clashes spread online, shared millions of times. Labour couldn't hide it. The entire nation was watching in real time as the government turned its police force against its own people. The backlash inside Parliament grew impossible to contain. Labour MPs from rural constituencies openly broke ranks, but thanks. Some crossed the floor, Councillors resigned en masse, declaring they would no longer serve a party that waged war on its own farmers. Even loyal ministers began to falter. Reports leaked of heated cabinet rows of ministers shouting at Starmer behind closed doors, warning him he was dragging the government to destruction. One chilling leak revealed a minister telling Starmer directly, "If you don't stop this, you won't just lose the farmers, you'll lose the country." But Starmer couldn't stop. He was trapped. If he backed down, his authority would be shattered. If he pushed forward, the revolt would consume him. And so, paralysed by pride and fear, he stumbled into the worst of both worlds, hesitating, posturing, but never acting decisively. The image of control he had built so carefully over the years was gone. What the people saw now was not a strong leader, but a weak man flailing against the tide. Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson capitalised on every moment. Farage hammered Labour daily, his speeches drawing massive crowds. He called the crackdown a Labour war on Britain itself and presented himself as the defender of freedom, law and the countryside. Robinson took the anger to another level. His rallies swelled with thousands. His chants of Starmer resign echoing through cities. For many, he gave voice to their raw fury. Fury at being silenced, taxed and trampled. The combination was explosive, Farage offering strategy and exposure, Robinson offering fire and defence. And then came the breaking point. Late one night, videos surfaced of police dragging farmers from their beds. Arrests carried out under the cover of darkness. One farmer, a grandfather in his 70s, collapsed during the raid. His wife screamed as officers forced her aside. The footage spread faster than anything before. By dawn, Britain erupted. Highways across the nation were blocked. Fuel tankers stopped. Food shipments halted. From Cornwall to Scotland, the country ground to a standstill. It was no longer a protest. It was an uprising. Faced with paralysis, Labour tried to regain control through media appearances. Starmer stepped onto the stage, his face pale, his tone stiff. He repeated the same tired lines about fairness, about climate responsibility, about protecting the public, but it was useless. Nobody listened. The chants outside his office were louder than his words. His authority had collapsed so completely that even his own MPS heckled him behind closed doors. Some demanded he resign immediately. Others plotted to force him out. The man who had promised stability was now the source of Britain's chaos. And in the palace, the whispers turned into something more. Reports emerged that King Charles had privately expressed deep anger that he considered the treatment of farmers a stain on the nation's honour. Though constitutional limits barred him from direct intervention, the symbolism was devastating. A furious monarch, a broken parliament, a nation in open revolt, all of it pointed in one direction. Starmer was finished. His approval ratings collapsed to historic lows. Labour's poll numbers plunged as Reform UK surged, fuelled by Farage's relentless campaign. Councillors resigned daily, local Labour branches dissolved, and the party's rural support evaporated. Every attempt at control ended in humiliation. Every act of suppression triggered another explosion. The climax came at a massive protest in London. Hundreds of thousands gathered. Farmers, Reform supporters, Robinson's base, ordinary families, even disillusioned Labour voters. Tractors lined the streets, their horns blaring. Protesters chanted in unison, "Starmer out! Starmer out!" The sound shook Westminster to its core. Police could not disperse them. The government could not silence them. For the first time in his premiership, Keir Starmer faced a crowd too large, too united and too determined to ignore. In that moment, Britain realised the truth. Keir Starmer had declared war on the countryside, but it was he who lost. His crackdown turned to chaos, his control dissolved into rebellion, and his government stood on the brink of collapse. The farmers had risen, the people had joined. Farage and Robinson had seized the moment, and now the demand was clear, undeniable, and echoing across the nation. Keir Starmer must resign. The man who promised stability left Britain in turmoil. The man who claimed to represent fairness had waged war on his own people. And the man who thought he could silence the countryside had instead awoken a rebellion that might bring down his entire government.